Hi stamping friends, welcome back. Sandi MacIver here, and I'm sharing one of my favorite obsessions today. I'm working with the Canson 90-pound cold press watercolor paper cut at 4 5/8 by 6 5/8, and I'm also using the Simon Says Stitch Circles dies to create circles for the moon and using this whole piece for a mask. Distressed oxides for today's project: Spice Marmalade, Peeled Paint, and Picked Raspberry. I'm placing the cut circle where I want the moon to be, and I'm shaking my oxide sprays from side to side, not up and down, so that they don't clog. I started with picked raspberry at the top, spiced marmalade through the middle, and finished with peeled paint across the bottom. Watch for excess ink runs and pat them off, and then use a heat tool to dry the ink. I'm going to use the mask to add mustard seed distressed oxide inks for my moon, and I'm using my blending tool in a circular motion, and I'm leaving blotches on purpose. It helps to create the crater for my moon look. I also reversed the mask and put the circle back on and went around the outside of my moon with ripe persimmon. Unfortunately, that didn't tape, and I'm not sure why, so sorry about that. I'm placing my art piece inside my misti, and I'm wedging it in tight into the bottom left corner using lots of magnets to hold it in place. I lay my oracle stamp where I want her, and then I close the arm of the misti to attach her to it. Open it again, ink the stamp with the Versafine Onyx black ink, and stamp. The misti allows you to stamp numerous times to ensure that you have a nice solid dark image, and you'll see that I have to stamp her quite a few times. The watercolor paper is a little bit on the lumpy side, so it does take a little bit to get this down. And you notice that I also wipe the edges. Be careful not to push too hard and transfer that ink. I'm cleaning my stamp with my wet chamois, and then I'm going to remove it, and I'm getting out my 3 little crows, and I decided on the crow looking over his shoulder, and I'm going to lay that down so he's standing on top of her staff. Close the misti to pick up the stamp, open it and ink it, and repeat. Note: if you're going to do the splattering that I'm going to do in the next couple of steps, you want to use a waterproof black ink when you're stamping all of these silhouette stamps. And you'll see the splattering technique as soon as I finally get this crow as dark as I want it. This took a little bit. He's not a completely solid image, and of course, again, lumpy watercolor paper. I'm going to remove the art piece from the misti now and lay it down on my glass mat. I have torn a sheet of copy paper to create a mask, and I'm going to use this to create the ground underneath of her and in the background. So lay it down where you want. I'm using Soot Black Distressed Oxides and my blending tool, and in kind of a downward motion I'm starting to add the ink, and this is going to create kind of a little mountain or ground that she's going to be standing on. And you don't want to fill in the entire thing. You want some of that peeled paint to show through, but go along the bottom and darken that as well. And you can check it. I keep my hand on it to make sure it stays in the same place. And now I'm flipping my mask over and moving it up a little bit into a different direction so that I'm making a second set of mountains in the background, but they're not exactly the same shape as the ones that I just finished creating. And work on that until you get it the way you like it. And I'm cleaning up my extra ink there, and there's my mountains so far. I'm putting my art piece back into my misti so I can stamp my large skeleton tree. Again, I'm securing the piece with magnets and then placing my tree where I want to stamp it. And I'm closing the lid to pick up the stamp, and I'm going to ink it and stamp it. The misti tool helps you repeatedly stamp in exactly the same place, and it makes it essential for this particular technique. I'm again using the Versafine Onyx black ink to ink up my tree, stamping it, and I'm going to do that a couple of times to make sure that I have a nice dark image. And then you'll see I'm using my chamois again to clean the tree off because I need to move it, and so I don't want to place a dirty stamp onto my art piece and move it around a few times. I'm going to stamp over on the left hand side, so I need to move my art piece over so that there's sufficient room to do that. So put as many magnets as you can onto your piece to hold it in place, and then place the stamp down, and you'll see the stamp is hanging over a little bit on the left. So I need to move it over a little bit further so that I can get the lid closed and get a good stamped image. And again, moving my magnets as close as I can to my stamp to ensure that my art piece stays in the position that I want it to, so I don't get kind of a shadowy halo effect when I do multiple stampings. So most of the tree's off, but you get the idea of that little tree being over there on the left-hand side. So cleaning the tree off and removing it so we can move on. It's splatter time! I have a sticky mask to protect the moon, and I created that with Inkadinkado mask paper, and I'm using the Nuvo Shimmer powders, Solar Flare and Kathleen Wheeler to create my splatter. I just squeeze a little bit into a well, add a little bit of water, and then use a couple of paintbrushes to mix the color really well together, and then just use that to do your splatter. And you'll notice that I'm also going to protect my oracle with my mask, my full mask. I'm just kind of laying it over top of her so that I don't get the splatter all over her as well, because she's the silhouette, so she's kind of supposed to be in the foreground. And so just splatter around. I started with the yellow, and then I'm going back with that red, and the red actually turns out almost the same color as the Marmalade. It's a little bit darker, so it adds a nice contrast. And I'm just kind of splattering it all over. And this also activates the distressed oxide spray that I used for the background, so it gives it a very cool effect. And you can put a piece of paper towel over this if you want to blot it up. I let it dry. So you have to be a little bit careful here because your shimmer paint is still wet unless you blotted it off. But what I'm doing is I've uncovered the moon, and I'm going to use the leftover shimmer paint to paint it, the yellow. And you want to make it blotchy. You want to leave lots of lines, but try and go around that crow as close as possible. And the Nuvo shimmer powders have a gold fleck in them, so it's going to make this moon absolutely fabulously shimmery. Are those words? This moon just turned out so well. I was just so really happy with it. I wanted even more craters in my moon, so I'm using a little bit of liquid gesso, and I poured it into one of the wells. And I'm using my yellow paintbrush again because I do go back and forth with those a little bit, so it doesn't matter if your paintbrush isn't really clean. And I just blotted some of the gesso on, and then I wiped the rest off onto my paper towel, and I went back and I blended it in a little bit, and I didn't paint it. I just kind of dabbed it up and down because I wanted the crater look. And now I'm going back over it with my shimmer paint that I've created with my powder, and this is going to add the shimmer back over top of the gesso again. I stole my foam mat out of the misti to put under my art piece for the next set of stamping, but you also want to make sure that everything's really dry before. I'm going to be stamping with the skeleton tree scene. These are the 3 small trees that come in a set, and I'm using the stamped off or first generation stamping for this technique, adding 3 trees in the background, and I don't want them solid and I don't want them big. So I want them in the background just kind of for background. Next, it's the foreground, and I'm going to be using the stamp called Quirky Mushrooms. These are pretty cool, and full ink, so full on, as dark as you can get it. You're going to stamp these at different heights around the foreground, and don't get it too busy. You don't want to take away from the oracle. The first card I did way too many, and I was unhappy with it, so I backed off this time. I'm going to add some background and some highlights and little blobs, and I'm using something that's kind of new to me. These are the Posco paint pen markers. These things are rock. And I've linked underneath the video and on my blog for the different sizes that I used and where I got them from. And you'll see that I'm making big and small dots, and I'm just moving around in the foreground. And these are my little lightning bugs. Every fairy's got a lightning bug, right? And I'm using the yellow. So the yellow pulls the bottom and kind of image together because you've got the big moon up at the top. So that's why I added some more yellow at the bottom and more little lightning bugs. And I'm just going around and trying to fill in around where my splatter was. And then I need a thin one, so I'm using my gel pen to add some highlights to the left side of the mushrooms, because that's where the moon glow would be going on the mushrooms, right? And then I'm adding some highlights into her wings. The top part of her is all her hair, but her wings are tucked down the back. So by adding a little bit of highlight there, and I do some dots and some dashes, and that really brings out her wings and makes them look like they're glistening in the moonbeam. I thought it was kind of a cool effect. I'm using a Uni Posca paint pen white, and this is a larger one, and this is 0.9 to 1.3 milligrams. It's called a bullet tip, and I'm adding highlights around the moon with it. So again, I'm making some large and small dots all the way around, just kind of like moon glow, and it serves to really highlight the moon and really make it pop as part of the art piece. And it takes a few minutes to go around. And again, you want to be careful that you're not sticking your hand into the ink that you just put down at the bottom of your art piece as well. I've done that a couple of times. But I did stop in between here when I had the camera turned off, and I heat set all of that so that it was nice and dry and I wouldn't have to worry about getting my hand in it. Now I'm going to add a few of the white into the trees. I just thought they needed a little bit of an extra kind of pull, and maybe we're looking at a few more lightning bugs up there and some trees in the background. And in hindsight, I don't think I would have done this. I would have left them the way they are, because it kind of takes away from the skeleton effect of the trees in the background. So there you go. And there's pink at the top of my art piece, so I decided I had one more of the Uni Posca pens, and this is a fine tip pink. And I'm going in and I'm adding a little bit of pink at the bottom. So let's pretend those are flowers, and just kind of to pull the whole image together. So this is a big card. I'm using my Score Buddy to fold and burnish my card. It started as a 10 by 7, and I scored and folded it at 5. And I have a black mat. The mat is 6 3/4 by 4 3/4, and I'm using lots of Mono Extreme tape, Tombow, to attach that, because that art piece has been wet a couple of times, and I want to make sure it's nice and flat so that it has a nice professional finish to it when I mat my card. And then more adhesive and attaching it to my coordinating card base. There we go. And I have dirty fingers, so I laid a piece of paper towel over it before I pushed it hard. I made this card a few times before I was happy with it. The one on the left is too dull, so that kind of eliminated it. The one on the right, I want to explain something to you. I did the gesso before I stamped the crow, and don't do that. You see her face and you see the crow, they turn out shiny, and they really stand out from the rest of the kind of muted stamping that you get from stamping just over the ink. So be careful with that one, and that's why I worked on just going around the crow and adding the gesso afterward. I hope you enjoyed today's video, and if you did, I'd sure appreciate a thumbs up. I have listed all the supplies that I used today just underneath the video in the comments, and there's also a link to my blog where you can get a free PDF doodle. And until next time, doodles! Thanks for visiting me today.